Holy shit, I just watched 3 episodes of Knights of Sidonia. Sadly, no relation to the awesome Muse song of the same title. Knights of Sidonia is based on a manga by Tsutomu Nihei, who actually happens to be one of my favorite artists, but I've never read this particular series. He's done the cult favorite Blame, which is totally awesome, and he also did Biomega, which is also totally awesome. Nihei is pretty much known for doing cyberpunk shows. His worlds are incredibly detailed and gritty and grimy and full of buildings and pipes and things like that. Tsutomu Nihei actually studied architecture, but then decided that instead of being an architect, he wanted to be a manga author. And in the Blame series, then the entire world is pretty much a building. Like, the earth itself is a structure, like a metallic structure full of pipes and shit. So the guy has a hard-on for architecture, and it looks gorgeous. I also have a hard-on for architecture, so I love his work. But the thing about it is that Blame was a sort of horror series. It was very quiet, and I know it's a manga, but there was like no dialogue is what I mean by it. It was just like action, and the main character, there would be chapters where he just like shows up on a floor of this structure and he'd just like see a corpse or something, and then he'd notice something weird about the corpse, and then like a monster would bust out of it and he'd fight the monster through, you know, pages of fighting, and then the chapter, he'd kill it and the chapter would be over. Like, that's it. So the very little story in it, it was more about just this mysterious world and adventuring through it and fighting things. Biomega had a lot more storyline, but it was like a over-the-top Hollywood action movie where by the end of like the first volume, there's like satellite cannons like firing down at the main character and shit, and there's a talking bear with a sniper rifle. It was insane. So Knights of Sidonia is a mecha series that I've never read, but what I get out of it is that Tsutomu Nihei was trying to make something more accessible. That's how I feel. Now, from what I've heard, the manga is actually kind of difficult to read just because it jumps around in its timeline a lot, and it's a little bit cryptic, and the anime is apparently a little bit more straightforward. Nonetheless, just on the conceptual level, the things that are happening in this series are more what you would expect from anime and manga than what you would get from other Tsutomu Nihei works. Gone is the sparsity of characters and sparsity of dialogue and plot. Now it's more plot-driven, more character-driven. The main character feels like every other anime main character. He's just some kind of wimpy guy who happens to be really amazing at piloting robots for some reason. And there's a bunch of girls who pretty much want him, and you're getting this sort of love triangle or even love quadrangle thing going on even as early as episode 3. There's one girl who keeps hanging out with him, and then there's the androgynous one who, I guess they called it like third gender. They choose their gender once they found a mate. I'm gonna call it a she just because it's got a female voice actress and looks like a girl, and for all intents and purposes in the storyline functions as a female. And they didn't ever give us like a name for the third gender. They just told us that there was one. So in any case, both of them are clearly in love with the main character. They keep having situations where one of them ends up with him and stuff like that. And because of all this stuff, it feels just really generic. Like, whereas Blame felt unique and interesting because it was so silent and just it was just the raw expression of here's some cool looking shit. And then this show has plot and stuff, but the plot is not an interesting plot. The characters are not interesting characters. They're just cookie cutter anime concept kind of things. I mean, the world it takes place in has some cool elements to it, like the third gender, or like people photosynthesize now and they don't have to eat but like once a week because they have photosynthesis. There's little cool things like that that help the world building, but overall it doesn't feel special or unique. There's still some horror elements. So far, the monsters that the characters have to fight with their mechs are very terrifying. They've killed a bunch of people already. Characters that were introduced and obviously going to die, but they did die. So the enemies are threatening, and you can tell that people are going to die throughout the show. Sort of like an Attack on Titan kind of feel, where it's killing off so many characters so early that it sets you up to think, okay, most characters are expendable. But like Attack on Titan, it's still kind of just a boring show about whatever, like it could be any other show. Now, the weirdest thing about Knights of Sidonia, and the thing that's going to probably be a deciding factor for most people before they even get to watch the show, is that the entire thing is in 3D CG. Now, I have nothing against 3D CG, and it's interesting that instead of having 2D characters on top of 3D environments or with 3D elements thrown in, they just said, fuck it, we'll make the whole thing 3D. But it's not exactly pretty to look at. I mean, the character models are atrocious. They're very simplistic. Almost every character has like the same face, the same movements. They look very lifeless, and it looks low budget and cheap, and the frame rate's really low on all the animation, so it's cheap looking. But I mean, it's not cheap looking to the point that it's unwatchable. Once I got used to it, I didn't mind so much, but it's definitely not a show I'm ever gonna be like, oh man, it was visually engaging, which is a shame because Tsutomu Nihei is mostly about the visuals in his manga. Like, that's what sells it, is how gorgeous his artwork is. So the backgrounds kind of look like his backgrounds and stuff, but I don't really like the color choices they use or the overall aesthetic of the show. It just is not as cool looking as his manga is, so it doesn't have the same gritty effect that his manga has. Now, mind you, again, I haven't read Knights of Sidonia, so I'm just speaking about his art in general, but the guy is an incredible artist, and the show does not reflect that. Altogether, I felt from these 3 episodes that I didn't really get anything out of it. Nothing about the plot really grabbed me, or the characters really grabbed me, or even the action, because it's not that well directed. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on. Characters are just kind of flying around in mechs. There's a hint of tactical battling, but nothing special. So altogether, I'm probably going to give this one more episode. If I think it's still boring and nothing really happens, I'm going to drop it. I know that this manga is fairly popular. It's like the most successful thing Tsutomu Nihei has done, but I don't know if that's because it's good, like I don't know if it gets better, or if it's just because it is the most accessible one, the only one that has like cute girls. It has some undressing scenes in the first episode and stuff, you know, there's a little bit of fan service and stuff thrown in, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, well, that's why people read this one, is because it had cute girls and fan service, and that's what his other works didn't have, and a somewhat accessible storyline. So I don't know, but I'll give it another episode and we'll see how it goes. And if you've seen it, let me know what you thought of it down below.